Our next guest is the president of the Crime Prevention Center, Research Center, John Lott, and he joins us now. How's it going?
Doing great. Great to talk to you.
Absolutely. Now, I just want to say something real quick before we kind of get into our discussion and talk more to my audience. Personally, I don't think you get enough credit for the work that you do in this industry. And the funny thing is, the vast majority of the stats that a lot of people like to throw around when it comes to talking about firearms in this country are largely come from you, and they don't even realize it. And so I just first and foremost want to thank you for the work that you have done, because I think it means a lot to this industry, and a lot of people don't even realize it.
Well, thanks. That's very nice of you. I mean, the reason why I got into this and the reason why I do it is just to try to figure out what makes people safer.
Yeah.
And, I guess I've been as surprised by how my views have changed over time simply because of the data that you find.
Yeah.
But I greatly appreciate your comments.
No, absolutely. So I bought the audio version and the hard copy version of your book, and there was a point in the book, part of the section of the book, where you talk about your experience in trying to have that kind of even conversation about firearms, especially back when you were a professor, and some of the issues that you were running into, and people how like when certain anti-gun organizations knew you were going to be on certain shows, they would either cancel or find reasons to get you kicked off of that segment. And I kind of, if you don't mind, want to have you speak to that just a little bit so that people can understand the environment that kind of goes on behind the scenes that a lot of people don't realize. When I hear people say all the time, well, why can't we just have even debate and even discussion when it comes to firearms in this country? And so can you touch on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I guess you're talking about my book, The War on Guns.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of gun control groups that basically have this agreement that they won't participate in a TV show if I'm going to be on it. And so I've had a number of times where I get asked by a producer if I can go and talk about a subject. I say, sure, I'm happy to do it. And I'm literally driving into the studio, and I'll get a call from the producer saying, well, we were just talking to the Bloomberg people that we had invited, and they're not willing to be on if you're on. Is there somebody else that you can suggest that has similar views to you that we could have on? And, it's just I can't imagine if I were to go to a producer and say, well, I'm just not willing to talk if somebody from the Bloomberg group is on.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine trying to say that. I assume they'd say, okay, well, fine, we'll get somebody else at that point. But for the gun control groups, the producers often go out of their way to try to be helpful to them. And, just last year, there was one case where I was on C-SPAN, Washington Journal, and it was unusual in terms of how the producer reacted there. They had a Bloomberg person already on, their research director. I got a call, said I was happy to do it. And the producer then told the Bloomberg people, and they said, well, we don't want Lott on. And she said, well, we've already invited him. He's agreed to be on. And they said, oh, our schedule's busy. We're not going to be able to go and do this. And she said, well, we'll still have Lott on. And then they found out that they could still participate, but they insisted that they be on separately from me, that they wanted me to be on the first half hour, and then they would be on the second half hour so that they could go and see what I had said. What made it unusual is that the producer got so upset with the way that they were trying to do it that she actually encouraged me to go and raise the point that they weren't willing to be on the show at the same time that I was. And I did that. And in fact, the first caller that they had on was someone who asked them why they didn't want to debate.
Yeah.
And my own belief is that the audience benefits much more from having people on at the same time to go and find out what argument's the strongest. But I think what's going on is basically that they think that if they try to say we won't participate with Lott and there's a uniform kind of front there across the different gun control groups, then the producer simply won't invite me on the show, and then they won't hear the arguments that are there. And I think it's unfortunate, but too often, 95% of the time, the producers let them get away with that.
Yeah, I ran into that myself a little bit. I was several years ago. I was supposed to be on a fireside chat with President Obama, and I was sought after to essentially ask a gun control question, and I submitted my questions. They loved the questions, and then when they presented it to his staff and so forth and so on, they told me I was a go. So I was going to be doing this fireside chat, and I was excited. I get to address the president, talk to the president about an issue that I care deeply about. And when I was able to, like that day, I was like, okay, it's going to happen. And then, like literally within an hour, I get a message basically telling me that his staff were like, we're fine with everybody else but him. You have to take him off.
Right.
And I was like,
I guess they were worried that you'd provide a different point of view that they didn't want to have aired or get publicity.
Yeah.
And it's they shouldn't be able to go and censor who they get to go and debate with. I can't tell you how many times, also just on college campuses and other places, that the gun control groups won't debate.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is, if there's a debate, I think you get larger crowds that show up.
Yep.
And so I think they view it as one way they can keep people from hearing the arguments. And my concern that I try to raise many times is that people have to understand that gun control laws may have some benefits, but they also have costs.
Yeah.
And the question is, what's the net effect? And many of the times, the people who get harmed the most from these gun controls are poor minorities who live in high crime urban areas and people who are relatively weaker physically, particularly women and the elderly. I would argue it's the most vulnerable people in our society that get hurt the most from these types of gun control laws. But it's more than simply saying that's the case. What I think they get concerned about is having evidence being provided that, in fact, those points are true.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely, and it's that's the most frustrating part about what I do is, I want to be able to get on as many platforms and be able to talk about this issue and respectfully, reasonably have that conversation. And I tried to make my show Noir a platform for that. But even then, when you reach out to certain people who disagree with you on an issue and say, "Hey, just come on my show and we'll talk it out," they won't they won't do it. And so it's incredibly frustrating. But you recently wrote about women, like we just got through talking about a little bit. You recently wrote about women and minorities buying more guns in 2017. So tell us a little bit about that.
Right. Well, we've seen a lot of changes over the last decade or so in terms of who buys guns and people's perceptions about guns. And probably over the last 5 years or so, at least, the biggest changes in perceptions, according to polls, have been from blacks and women in terms of whether they think guns are beneficial or not. And you've seen that in terms of things like concealed handgun permits. The rate that women have been getting concealed handgun permits has increased about twice as fast as it has for men. And you see for blacks, it's about 80% faster than it is for whites. And I'm glad that we're seeing those changes because those are the groups who benefit the most from having guns. But, when you're talking about a woman, for example, women are relatively weaker physically. When you're talking about a male criminal attacking them, which is almost always the case, there's a larger strength differential that exists between a man attacking a female than a man attacking another man. And the presence of a gun represents a much bigger relative change in a woman's ability to go and defend herself. My research shows that the drop in violent crime against women that you find from more women carrying a permanent concealed handgun is over twice as large as the drop that you see in violent crime against men from additional men carrying a permanent concealed handgun. It's about 2.5 times larger. And then the other group of people that benefit so much are poor minorities, particularly blacks who live in high crime areas. The people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime benefit the most from having the option to protect themselves. Anybody who's read my books knows that I think police are extremely important in stopping crime. I think they're probably the single most important factor.
Yeah.
But the thing that even the police themselves understand is that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime's occurred. And the question is, what do you recommend that people do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves? And simply telling people to behave passively is not very good advice. It's much more likely to result in serious injury or death to the crime victim in that case.
Absolutely. And we really think about it. I call it the elusive obvious, because a lot of people don't think about something like that. In our minds, I think we've all kind of grown up thinking, you call the police, they're there instantly. Right. But then when you really when you check that aspect of it against reality, it's like, wow, actually, no, that makes no sense, because I have to call, and then that's to say I'm even in a position to call the police when something happens, and then I have to wait for them to get there. And it makes a lot of sense after you say it, but I mean, it's almost so simple it eludes us.
Right. So take simple law that the Bloomberg groups are pushing very strongly, and that's these background checks on private transfers of guns. Everybody wants to stop criminals from being able to go and obtain guns.
Yep.
The problem is that the current background check system's a mess, and it's a mess in a couple ways. One is just you have the fact that who gets stopped? Well, we frequently hear, whether it's President Obama or Hillary Clinton or others, will go and say there's 3 million people who have been stopped from buying guns. Prohibited or dangerous people have been stopped from buying guns because of background checks. And it's simply false. What they should say is that there have been 3 million initial denials. But there's a huge difference between initial denials and saying you've actually stopped a dangerous person. An example I often give people is, remember the late Senator Ted Kennedy?
Yeah.
There were 5 times where he was stopped from flying on a plane, simply because he had a name similar to somebody that they wanted to stop. Now, do we count those 5 times as 5 times we stopped a terrorist from flying? Presumably nobody would count it that way.
Yeah.
But that's the way they're counting these denials when you're talking about background checks for guns. It's one thing to stop a felon from buying a gun. It's another thing to stop someone simply because they have a name similar to a felon from buying a gun. And the problem is, who gets stopped? Not only do we have this 3 million mistakes that are essentially there, because virtually all of these are mistakes, but it's particular groups that could harm the most. So, for example, people tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. 40% of the Vietnamese in the United States have the same last name. Hispanics have names similar to other Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other blacks. 30% of black males in the United States are legally prohibited from owning a gun because of past criminal history. Well, whose names are they most likely to be confused with? Other law-abiding, good black males who want to go and buy a gun to protect themselves or their families. There's no reason why that type of mistake should be occurring. If private companies do background checks on employees and they had an error rate that was 100th the error rate that the federal government has, they'd be sued out of existence. The government has all the information it needs. When you fill out a 4473 form to buy a gun, you put down your name, your social security number, your address, and your birthday. But what the government does is it just looks for phonetically similar names and your birthday. It doesn't use the social security number, and it doesn't use your address. And that's the reason why they're so likely to get people who have similar names but aren't the same person. But the other problem with the background checks is that they're costly. I don't know if you're in D.C. right now, but in D.C., it costs $175 right now to privately transfer a gun. In New York City, there's one store that will do it for $125, and then there's others that will do it for $150 or more.
And we're talking about guns here that are probably that are easily in the $400 to $500 to almost $1,000. So then on top of that, I have to pay an additional $175, which I essentially consider a tax. Is insane.
That's exactly what it is. And so, in other places, it may be $55 or $60, but it's still a significant tax, effectively, on gun. Now, who who do they think they stop from buying a gun because of having that high fee that you have to pay?
No one.
It's poor people who get. So in Connecticut, they're talking about raising the price of a permit for a concealed handgun from $140, which is already twice the national average for concealed carry permits, to $370. That's on top of the training costs and fingerprint fees and other things that you have to get a concealed handgun permit there. $370 may not stop you or I from getting it.
It'd make me think twice.
Right. But the people who need it the most,
the
people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime, that may make a difference between whether they're able to legally have a gun to be able to go and defend themselves. And I think it's those types of arguments that you would make or I would make that the gun control advocates particularly don't want people to hear.
Absolutely. We are out of time, but real quick before we wrap up, can you go ahead and plug your book and let people know where they can get it?
Well, thanks. Well, the book's The War on Guns, the most recent one, and they should be able to get it at places like Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com.
Okay, absolutely. Well, thank you very much, John. I hope you join us again at some point. You have open door policy here. Anytime you want to come on, let us know, and we'll have you.
Well, that's very nice. If you could just send me an email off the air, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, absolutely.
But thank you very much for having me on.
All right, will do. And I'll definitely get that email out to you ASAP.
Thank you.
When we come back, we're going to get a little preview of this year's NRA annual meetings.